The morning of September 12, 2024, broke quietly over Miami's Biscayne Bay. Sunlight crept across the water, glinting off rows of yachts and the glass of luxury condos. But outside one gated estate on Star Island, the stillness was shattered by the thrum of helicopter blades. At 6:17 a.m., a team of federal agents moved in. They were from Homeland Security Investigations and the U.S. Marshal Service, executing a sealed warrant. The man they came for was Sean Combs, better known to the world as Diddy. Neighbors awoke to sirens and the low, commanding voice of a loudspeaker. Reporters, tipped off minutes earlier, crowded behind the security gate as agents filed to the front doors of the property. Inside, Combs was said to be awake, wearing a robe and surrounded by attorneys who had received whispers of the raid, but not its scope. To the outside world, Diddy had long seemed untouchable, a self-made billionaire who turned Bad Boy Records into one of the most successful labels in hip-hop history. He'd survived the East Coast, West Coast rivalry of the 1990s, launched clothing lines, reality shows, and vodka brands. He was, in every sense, the embodiment of the American hustle. But that morning, the image began to unravel. When agents left the mansion hours later, they carried boxes of digital drives, ledgers, and sealed envelopes marked financial evidence. In a separate location, another team searched his Los Angeles property. Before the day was over, Combs was in federal custody. The official charges, unsealed later that afternoon, listed sex trafficking, racketeering, and transportation to engage in prostitution. Prosecutors alleged that Combs had orchestrated an interstate network of abuse and coercion, a claim he would immediately and forcefully deny. The arrest set off a shockwave that rippled across music, media, and pop culture. Within hours, news outlets replayed old clips. Diddy dancing beside the notorious B.I.G., Diddy accepting awards, Diddy speaking about perseverance. Each image was now reframed, haunted by the question of what had been happening behind closed doors. For decades, his brand had rested on confidence and control. Yet those same traits, investigators claimed, had been weaponized, turned into instruments of domination and secrecy. The initial affidavit, heavy with redactions, described a pattern of recruitment and manipulation stretching back years. Former employees, some protected by immunity, told investigators of hidden rooms, coded language, and a hierarchy of fear. Whether all of it would hold up in court was uncertain. But the story was already moving faster than the facts could follow. In Brooklyn, federal prosecutors announced that the case had been building quietly since 2023, fueled by witness statements and bank transactions tied to Combs' corporate entities. Each detail was a thread in a widening tapestry. The portrait of a mogul who, in the government's eyes, had blurred the line between business empire and criminal enterprise. For his supporters, it was unthinkable. Diddy had been a philanthropist, a mentor, a symbol of black entrepreneurship. To them, the charges felt like a dismantling of legacy, a narrative written by those who had always envied his power. But as Combs was transported to the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn that night, power was no longer his. His wrists were bound. His phone was confiscated. The empire he'd built from Harlem basements to Madison Square Garden could not shield him from the four walls that awaited. Inside the holding cell, a single fluorescent bulb buzzed overhead. For the first time in 30 years, there were no assistants, no producers, no entourage. Just silence and the sound of his own breathing. Outside, the narrative took on a life of its own. Civil lawsuits multiplied, each alleging variations of the same story. Control, fear, and the abuse of influence. Some claims were years old, others newly filed. Attorneys lined up television interviews. Pundits debated the fall of another cultural icon. Through his representatives, Diddy declared his innocence and promised to fight every charge. His lawyers called the allegations a calculated attempt to destroy a black businessman who refused to bow. Yet even those who believed him could sense that something irreversible had happened. Because the truth about moments like these is rarely simple. Public perception hardens faster than any verdict. And when an empire falls, it does so in silence long before the world hears the crash. By dawn the next morning, federal custody had stripped away the stage lights, the designer suits, the headlines. All that remained was a man facing the most consequential battle of his life. The arrest was only the beginning, the spark that would ignite months of courtroom drama, revelations, and controversy. It was a day the story of Sean Diddy Combs shifted from music history to criminal history. And for investigators, it marked the start of a question that would consume the next year. Was this the exposure of a long-hidden crime, or the overreach of a system eager to make an example of power? The answers would come slowly. But for Diddy, confined to a federal cell that first night in September, one truth had already settled in. The life he knew was over, and a new, unforgiving chapter had just begun. Long before the raids, long before the courtroom cameras and the word trafficking entered the headlines, Sean Combs was an unstoppable force, a man whose willpower alone seemed to bend the culture around him. Born in Harlem in 1969, he grew up in a neighborhood where dreams often stopped at the corner store. His father, Melvin Combs, was shot and killed when Sean was just 3. That early loss became a silent fuel, the engine of a lifelong obsession with control. At Howard University, he was not just a student. He was a movement. Friends called him Puffy because he was always hustling, always in motion. He interned at Uptown Records and quickly became a storm within the industry. Loud, charismatic, relentless. By his early 20s, he was producing platinum albums, shaping the sound of modern hip-hop. He founded Bad Boy Records in 1993, and within a few short years, the label became an empire. Biggie Smalls, Faith Evans, 112 total. Every name that came through his doors seemed to turn into gold. Combs wasn't just a producer. He was an architect of a new era. In public, Diddy was joy and excess personified. Champagne toasts, white parties, million-dollar stages. Behind the scenes, though, those who worked closest to him spoke of something else entirely. Perfectionism that bordered on mania. Days that stretched into nights without sleep. A boss whose temper could turn an entire room to ice. To some, it was the price of greatness. To others, it was something darker, a need to dominate every inch of his world, every person within reach. By the mid-2000s, Diddy had transcended music. He was a global brand, actor, fashion mogul, and businessman. Ciroc Vodka, Sean John Clothing, television ventures. His influence was everywhere. His wealth was measured not just in millions, but in reach. And yet, even at the height of his empire, whispers began to surface. Quiet rumors in industry circles about parties that stretched for days. Guests signed non-disclosure agreements. Security guards turned away phones. Those who attended spoke only in fragments of extravagance that blurred into something unnerving. It was easy at first to dismiss it all as celebrity gossip. The world had seen the same story before. Powerful figures accused by unnamed sources, headlines that flared and faded. But a pattern was forming, even if few were willing to see it then. For the women who later came forward, Cassie Ventura among them, the truth, they said, was hidden behind a wall of glamour and silence. Cassie, once Diddy's protege and longtime partner, filed a civil suit in late 2023 alleging years of abuse and control. Within 24 hours, the case was settled privately. To many, that seemed like an end. To investigators, it was the beginning. Federal prosecutors quietly began revisiting older reports and sealed settlements. They found financial transfers matching witness accounts, flights booked under aliases, communication logs that hinted at coordination between assistants, drivers, and event planners, not for business, but for control. It was during these months of quiet digging that the image of Diddy began to fracture. The mogul who once symbolized resilience and innovation now faced questions about the system he had built around himself, a system designed to serve, to obey, to conceal. His former employees described a culture of loyalty so strict it bordered on fear. You didn't say no to Puff, one anonymous source told investigators. No wasn't a word he understood. Still, for every accusation, there were defenders, artists and executives who swore that Diddy had given him opportunities no one else would. He changed lives, said one former collaborator. Whatever happened behind the scenes, none of us would be here without him. That conflict between inspiration and intimidation became the central tension of his legacy. Was he a visionary who demanded the best, or a man whose power had gone unchecked for too long? By the time of his 2024 arrest, The lines between those identities had blurred. To the world, Diddy had always been a symbol of triumph, proof that a kid from Harlem could climb higher than anyone believed possible. But behind that fame, prosecutors claimed, was a world governed not by success, but by secrecy. And as the investigation deepened, those whispers of private excess began to sound like premonitions. Every closed-door meeting, every NDA, every whisper warning, all of it now read like evidence of something building, waiting for the moment when image and truth would finally collide. In the months after his arrest, as his lawyers fought for bail and public opinion swung between outrage and disbelief, one thing became clear. The story of Sean Combs was no longer about fame. It was about the weight of power, and what happens when that power turns inward. The mogul who once stood atop the world was now staring at a system that had finally turned its gaze back on him. And for the first time, it wasn't a stage light, it was a spotlight. The downfall of Sean Diddy Combs did not happen overnight. It began in fragments, sealed files reopened, anonymous tips re-examined, and a series of interviews that slowly pulled the curtain back on the world behind the music. By early 2024, federal investigators had begun assembling a timeline that stretched across 2 decades. The picture it painted was less about isolated moments and more about control, the way power, money, and silence worked together to form a kind of private kingdom. The case against Combs was built under federal sex trafficking and racketeering statutes, laws designed to dismantle organized networks. But this wasn't cartel or a gang. It was a business empire, run from penthouses, luxury hotels, and exclusive recording studios. Agents described it as a criminal enterprise masked as entertainment. Witnesses claimed that Diddy's influence extended far beyond music. Some spoke of manipulation, disguised as mentorship. Others described coercion, threats, and systemic fear. Those stories, once whispered among insiders, now filled court filings and public testimony. In May 2024, after months of pretrial hearings, the case went before a jury. Cameras lined the courthouse steps. Protesters and supporters stood side by side, separated only by the signs they carried. Some demanding justice, others shouting that the system was trying to destroy another black success story. The prosecution laid out a meticulous case. Flights arranged for specific guests. Payments disguised as entertainment expenses. Confidential staff who allegedly helped coordinate encounters that prosecutors said crossed into exploitation. The defense countered with a simple refrain. There was no enterprise, no coercion, only fame twisted by jealousy and regret. Over 8 weeks of testimony, the courtroom became a theater of contradictions. Artists, assistants, ex-partners, and bodyguards each offering their version of the truth. Cassie Ventura's name echoed through proceedings, as did others who had once been part of Combs' orbit. Then came July 2nd, 2024. The jury's decision was split. Combs was acquitted of the most serious charges, racketeering and sex trafficking, but found guilty on 2 counts of transportation to engage in prostitution. The verdict sent a jolt through the industry. Some called it justice served. Others said it was a compromise. When sentencing arrived that October, the courtroom was silent. The judge called his actions a grave abuse of influence and handed down a 50-month federal sentence, just over 4 years in prison. Diddy's expression barely changed. He nodded once, as if accepting the moment, then was led away. He was first sent to the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn, before being transferred to FCI Fort Dix in New Jersey. Behind the wire fences of that low-security facility, one of music's richest men began serving his time. Quietly, strategically, already thinking of the next move, because while the world debated his guilt, Diddy's lawyers were already drafting an appeal. They argued that the trial had been mishandled, that key evidence was misinterpreted, and that his conviction rested on flawed assumptions about intent. In late October 2025, they filed for a fast-tracked appeal. And on November 3rd, Judge Beth Robinson granted the request, expediting the process and giving Combs a rare legal victory, one that could potentially shorten his time behind bars. For the first time in months, there was movement, a date, a chance. The man once known for his empire now had a new goal, freedom. And this time, every motion, every deadline, every appeal would decide how or if he would get it. Inside the sprawling fences of FCI Fort Dix, Sean Diddy Combs' world had become unrecognizable. The cell was small, the days repetitive, and the silence unrelenting. For a man who built an empire from noise and motion, confinement was both punishment and revelation. Prison records described him as compliant, quiet, focused on his routine. He worked out each morning before dawn, attended counseling sessions, and enrolled in the residential drug abuse program, a rehabilitation course that could shorten his sentence by months under the First Step Act. But those who knew Combs said it wasn't redemption he was chasing. It was strategy. He wanted time back. Freedom. The one thing money could never buy fast enough. His legal team, led by veteran appellate attorneys, spent months combing through trial transcripts and motions. They believed the prosecution had overreached, that the jury's partial verdict revealed uncertainty, not guilt. They argued that prosecutors blurred the line between moral wrongdoing and criminal conduct, painting Combs as a monster to win public approval. In October 2025, their argument reached the Second Circuit Court of Appeals. The request was simple but urgent. Expedite the appeal process before his remaining prison time made the case irrelevant. To ensure that Mr. Combs could meaningfully benefit from any appellate ruling vacating his sentence, the filing read, "We propose an accelerated schedule." That strategy wasn't just procedural. It was personal. By late 2025, Diddy had already served roughly 14 months of his 50-month sentence, time credited from his arrest in September 2024. Every day mattered. Every delay could make the entire appeal meaningless. Then, on November 3rd, 2025, the decision came. Judge Beth Robinson signed the order granting the expedited process. The government didn't oppose it, a silent acknowledgement that even the system was willing to move faster this time. The ruling set specific dates. Combs' opening brief was due December 23rd, 2025. The government's response, February 20th, 2026. His reply, March 13th, 2026. Oral arguments could begin as early as April. For his supporters, it was a sign of hope, a window where a sentence would be reduced or even vacated. For his critics, it was yet another reminder of privilege in motion, the machinery of influence grinding behind courtroom doors. Yet in truth, it was neither. The appeal didn't mean freedom. It meant possibility. The faint shimmer of light through the bars of federal cell. Inside Fort Dix, that mattered. Combs began reading more, writing daily, and mentoring younger inmates through entrepreneurship workshops. Some said he seemed calmer, more reflective. Others thought it was just focus. The same laser intensity that once turned demos into platinum records now turned toward the law. Outside, the media attention shifted again. Commentators debated whether the sentence had been too lenient, while others argued that the partial acquittal meant the system had already spoken fairly. But for Combs, the turning point wasn't about headlines or reputation. It was about control, the one thing that had defined him from Harlem to Hollywood. In prison, control was limited to time and choice. Through his appeal, he had found a way to reclaim both. He could not rewrite the past. But for the first time since his arrest, the future was no longer a wall. It was a door, and it had just been unlocked. The story of Sean Diddy Combs now stands at a crossroads, one where fame and accountability, influence and redemption meet under the watchful eye of the law. For decades, he shaped the sound of a generation, from the pulse of bad boy records to the polished glow of global branding. But as 2025 draws to a close, the rhythm that once defined him has slowed into something quieter, more uncertain. The expedited appeal, approved on November 3rd, isn't a guarantee of release. It's a legal window, narrow, technical, but vital. If the appellate judges find that the lower court mishandled his case, his conviction could be vacated, his sentence reduced, or his trial even retried. If they uphold it, the remainder of his 50-month term will carry on until 2028. But beyond the court filings and deadlines lies a deeper question, one that no appeal can easily answer. What happens when the architect of an empire must rebuild himself from the inside out? To some, Combs remains a symbol of perseverance, a man who defied every barrier to become one of the most powerful figures in entertainment. To others, His conviction marks the unraveling of a culture that for too long mistook wealth and charisma for innocence. In that tension lies the true legacy of this case. Not just the outcome, but what it represents. The collision between power and accountability in a world where image can obscure reality. Inside Fort Dix, Combs continues to work toward rehabilitation, earning credits through educational and therapeutic programs that could shorten his time. His attorneys remain confident, describing the appeal as a course correction, an opportunity to challenge what they see as an inconsistent verdict. Yet, public opinion has shifted. For many, the details of the trial, the testimonies, the settlements, the unanswered questions, have forever altered how they see him. The mogul who once commanded stages now faces a different kind of scrutiny. The quiet, enduring kind that follows long after the headlines fade. Still, even in that uncertainty, there is motion. Combs' team continues to plan for what comes next, a potential return to business, a reimagined career, perhaps even a public reckoning. Whether that future will unfold depends on the months ahead, on legal briefs, judicial decisions, and a court that will decide whether his story remains one of downfall or redemption. In a way, this moment mirrors the very art he once championed. Hip-hop was built on resilience, on taking broken pieces and turning them into rhythm, sound, and meaning. Now, the man who helped shape that story must find out if he can do the same with his own life. As spring 2026 approaches and oral arguments near, the world will once again turn its attention to his name. Not for a new record, not for a headline performance, but for the verdict that will decide how his empire's final act is written. Whether it ends in freedom or finality, one truth remains. The legend of Diddy, the artist, the mogul, the man, will never be remembered just for the music he made, but for the storm he left behind and the silence that followed.